Defense is a divisive subject. There was a pervasive belief for many years that it was simply bad. Menacing reforges were far superior to warding, and only inexperienced players would do anything besides optimize for damage. In particular, there are three common opinions I see about defense. Defense isn't helpful on Master and Legendary mode since everything will kill you quickly anyway. Defensive builds aren't good for mages and summoners since they have naturally low defense and won't be able to do it effectively. Defense is pointless for skilled players since they can just dodge to avoid damage. It'll just take longer to kill things with no upside. Every one of these is wrong, and I'll explain why over the course of this video. To start with, though, let's talk about how defense works. Defense is a number shown in the bottom right corner of your inventory, which reduces incoming damage by a flat amount. On Classic, that amount is half your defense, on Expert it's 3/4, and on Master it's the full defense value. This is rounded up each time. This scaling effectiveness only applies to players. Enemy defense will always reduce incoming damage by half of its value. This is also true in PvP. While each individual point of defense is more powerful on higher difficulties, enemies also get higher damage attacks. The two balance each other out, with defense overall becoming less effective on higher difficulties. You obtain defense from a variety of sources, primarily armor and accessories. Summoner typically has the lowest defense, followed by Mage, Ranger, and Melee. You'll always take at least 1 point of damage, and defense cannot reduce it below that. Defense will not affect damage from debuffs, such as Spasmatism's Cursed Inferno. This is indirect damage. It will affect falling damage, lava damage, spike damage, thorn damage, and any other source that causes you to get hit for damage. This is direct damage. There are some debuffs that will reduce your defense. These work how you would expect, except that your defense can never be reduced below 0. The same is true for debuffs that you inflict to enemies. So, defense in Terraria is extremely straightforward. Whatever direct damage you're taking, you just subtract your defense from it after being adjusted for difficulty. Defense is only part of the picture though. The damage that's reduced is constant, but the damage you take isn't. Almost every source of direct damage in Terraria is subject to a small amount of deviation from its given value. There's a plus or minus 15% range, which is randomly determined and influenced by luck. This is why the same attack will hit you for different amounts of damage. Like I said, this applies to almost all direct damage, but not all direct damage. The exceptions don't have a pattern, and this list might not include all of them, but falling damage, lava damage, the Shield of Cthulhu, and the lawnmower are not subject to random damage variation. It's important to understand this variation because it makes definite calculations impossible. I can't say that you can survive X number of hits or an attack will deal exactly Y damage to you because of this. What I can say is the minimum, average, and maximum damage that an attack will deal. I'll be using average damage values for most of this video, but keep in mind it will be variable in practice. That's all the basic information you'll need for the rest of this video. Really, the key question of this video is, are warding accessories worth it? You've got between 5 and 7 accessory slots, which can be reforged to give you either damage or defense. Is a flat plus 28 defense better than plus 28% damage? The immediate reaction of many players is to go no, especially on higher difficulties. As you get to Master Mode, enemies have triple the damage and triple the HP, with bosses only having about double HP. A commonly repeated argument is that taking 28 less damage a hit isn't gonna do much when you're getting hit for 300, but making fights go 28% faster is pretty significant. Like I said earlier, defense does get less effective on higher difficulties. The thing is, defense on Classic is obscenely, unbelievably, ridiculously overpowered. If you spec your character into defense, use warding accessories, put on flesh knuckles and hero shields, almost no bosses will pose anything resembling a threat to you. You're unkillable outside of a few exceptions, and this is assuming you stand completely still. If you actually move around to dodge, you're genuinely unkillable. Yes, defense is less effective on Master Mode, but when the thing you're less effective than is one of the most overpowered things in the game, less effective doesn't mean much. If you don't believe me, everything that's been playing out in the video recently isn't on Classic, it isn't on Expert, this is Master Mode. Defense can be incredibly useful on every difficulty if properly utilized. This argument is highly flawed. It appears reasonable at a glance, but falls apart quickly. You do take 28 less damage per hit on Master Mode with warding accessories in Hard Mode. A player might also use flesh knuckles and similar accessories to increase that number considerably. Do you get hit for 300 on Master Mode? Not really. There are some enemies that can hit for 300 or more damage, but those attacks are almost always melee attacks and almost always from non-boss enemies. Very, very few bosses have attacks that deal anywhere near that much damage. Furthermore, those highly damaging attacks are typically the easiest ones to dodge. The role that warding plays on high difficulties is not to let you AFK and eat attacks endlessly. It primarily lets you survive difficult to dodge projectile attacks from bosses by substantially reducing their damage. Regular enemies in hard mode will be highly lethal, and defense will often not be particularly effective against them. So, exactly how much damage from bosses are we talking about? I'm going to look at a typical summoner, mage, ranger, and melee build against every boss in the game on master mode. For each one of these bosses, I'm going to assess how much damage the player will be taking in the following 3 scenarios. A fully damage-focused build with no defense bonuses outside of armor and a food buff. Typical armor and basic buffs like an Iron Skin potion along with accessories reforged to warding. This is what your average player is using. A highly optimized setup putting a ton of effort into defense. This will often involve using odd combinations of armor and accessories. Now, you could just use the melee armor and use non-melee weapons. That's a common hardcore strategy, so the non-melee setups are still going to try to use some appropriate armor. These setups will still be effective at dealing damage as a result. You aren't trading all of your offense for defense, just some of it. Since this is on master mode, defense will only be more effective on classic and expert. I'll talk about legendary later. Get comfy, because this is going to take a while. The Eye of Cthulhu deals 45 damage in Phase 1 and 54 in Phase 2, with the Servants dealing 36 damage. It also gets a very minor damage increase near death, but I'm not going to go over that. Summoners at this stage have very little armor, and having all of your accessories reforged to warding gives you a massive defense boost, enough to nullify almost all of the Eye's damage. Every defense build hinges on using warding accessories, and as a result, you need to do goblins before any bosses. Don't stress about getting perfect accessories. You can easily get a warding reforge on shackles or flippers to fill out slots for extra defense. Shimmer forging can save a lot of money on expensive accessories like balloons and boots. Making the most effective defense build before the evil bosses is going to require ignoring summoner armor and using platinum instead. Platinum armor is incredible for defense. You lose out on 1 minion slot by not using the coat, so be sure to fish up some variegated loudfish in the underground jungle to make a summoning potion to compensate. We round out the build with a Bast statue from the underground desert. You can get a few of them, so be sure to take them around and place them in your arenas like campfires. This brings us up to 61 defense, enough to bring our damage taken on an average hit to 1, regardless of the Eye's phase, even after it gets the damage boost near death. Ranger and melee use the same setup with platinum armor. Mage, however, can comfortably use jungle armor, losing only 3 defense. Against King Slime using the same setups, we see that defense is extremely effective against the slimes that King Slime spawns, rendering them nearly harmless, and reduces its direct contact damage from a devastating 80 to 90 to a dangerous but manageable 30 to 40. All that this is really showing is that having access to the 24 defense from warding accessories is extremely powerful and quite unbalancing to obtain for the first few bosses who expect the player to have much worse gear. If you go out of your way to build this much defense and 400 HP, you can expect the first 2 bosses to be a pushover, even with the average build. The evil bosses are the first where we see the story start to shift. The Eater deals quite high damage with its head and vile spit, and defense cannot fully negate them. You will need to put some effort into avoidance strategies, particularly as the Eater begins to break into many pieces with many heads. The fully optimized build will take about half as much damage per hit from the heads as a player that just reforged their accessories to warding, which is a pretty significant improvement. When the Eater is intact, you can easily stand inside of its body and take negligible damage, even with the average build. This is a great way for melee players to deal damage quickly or to keep yourself safe from the more dangerous head and spit attacks. The vile spit is by far the most damaging attack the Eater has, and the weak debuff decreases your defense. Because of that, you should fight the Eater underground, where the spitting is much less common. Fighting on the surface gives you more space, but also causes the boss to rapidly use its highest damage and longest range attack. These 2 builds take noticeably less damage than the damage build, but compared to each other, the difference isn't that large. The biggest improvement of the optimized build is making the mouth hits deal about half as much damage. The Brain of Cthulhu's numbers look pretty promising here, but there's a catch. Yes, with the 3rd build, creepers will be reduced to 1 damage per hit and the brain to about 20. However, there is a roughly 13% chance that the creepers will inflict broken armor on you, cutting your defense in half and causing you to take 25 or 30 more damage per hit. Because of that, defense is effective against the brain, but outright tanking is not. You can take hits in isolation, but cannot comfortably take multiple hits in rapid succession if given the broken armor debuff. For Queen Bee, Summoner will be changing to Obsidian armor. While we lose 5 points of defense, the extra summon slots and whip buffs make it a worthwhile trade-off. With Queen Bee, defense makes her dash attack considerably less dangerous, but not completely harmless. Her stingers and summoned bees, on the other hand, are pretty comfortably negated. Due to the bees having the lowest damage in the fight, with a defensive build, you can just stand still on top of bees without killing them. They'll give you iframes when hitting you, preventing Queen Bee from hurting you and giving you a chance to regenerate lost HP. Mage will continue to use jungle armor, reaching a similar effectiveness to summoner. Ranger should use crimson armor, ideally due to the increased HP regeneration, but in a corruption world, shadow is fine too. Melee finally gains access to molten armor, and this is where we see a core concept of defense becoming clear. The more defense you have, the more effective each individual point of defense becomes. Summoner, with only 10 fewer points of defense, is taking 10 times as much damage from the average stinger hit compared to melee. Deerclops and Skeletron will continue using the same setups. With Deerclops, you'll notice that almost all of her attacks do negligible damage to a defense build, particularly the optimized one with molten armor. The only high damage attack is the snowball attack, which she'll only do if the player is distant. Because of that, you want to stay close. She'll inflict the frozen debuff with her ice spikes, but an effective strategy is to simply grapple or sit on a minecart while physically inside her body. You'll be repeatedly hit for a minimal amount of damage while also gaining iframes that prevent freezing. Skeletron's damage values on everything except his hands are too high for a player to comfortably sustain repeated damage from. What defense does achieve is drastically increasing the number of hits you can take before dying. Attacks from the hands are frequently reduced to single digits, making the main threat from them knockback and the slow debuff rather than gradually accumulating damage. They, on their own, will not kill you. The skull is a danger, but this damage number looks not that bad. The only problem is it's flat out wrong. That's not how much damage a skull deals, because it gets a 30% damage boost on expert mode and above when spinning, meaning it actually deals this much. You'd expect to see this reflected somewhere in his wiki article. It's not. But how much of a difference is 30% going to make? That's just a lot, actually. You're taking on average between 110 and 120 damage with the damage builds and 70 to 80 with the defensive ones. The former will kill you in 4 hits from full HP, which you probably won't be at since the hands will whittle you down, and the latter will kill in 6, and you're much more likely to be at full HP because the hands deal negligible damage. You have substantially longer to escape a stun lock before dying with a defensive build, and when you do escape, you don't have to worry about the hands finishing you off. Skeletron's homing skulls deal a little less damage, so the story is the same for them. They'll gradually wear down your HP, and a good defensive build can sustain damage much better and survive about twice as many hits compared to one that neglects defense. Following Skeletron, Ranger is able to upgrade to Necro Armor and the Obsidian Shield becomes available. For the rest of these builds, I will be giving the average and tanky characters the Obsidian Shield. If you've ever tried to fight the Wall of Flesh in larger multiplayer games as melee, you'll be familiar with the insane amount of damage that the Hungry deal as the Wall of Flesh drops below half HP. It is completely unsustainable for a pre-hard mode character, and you cannot remain close to the Wall of Flesh unless you are able to kill or knock back the Hungry. The Wall of Flesh's body also does extremely high contact damage, and the Bass statue is effectively a non-option as the fight needs to be done over an extended area, reducing your defensive capabilities. However, the Wall of Flesh is a fight of avoidance. You should be staying out of range of the melee attacks. The most likely source of damage over the course of the fight are the lasers, and against those, defense is effective. The wall's laser damage scales over the course of the fight, but as you can see, a defensive summoner will be able to survive over 3 times as many lasers at minimum damage and about twice as many at maximum damage. For Mage, Ranger, and Melee, those numbers only become more generous as defense gets higher. So, we have a choice between getting about 25% better damage or surviving 2 to 3 times as many laser hits. That's not a decision. In pre-hard mode, defensive builds are the best. Warding provides astronomically more value than Menacing even against the Wall of Flesh. Just putting warding on your accessories for a regular build is very impactful, and it gets better if you focus more on defense. Of course, this implies the player is taking damage, and I discuss the merits of defense when dodging is feasible later. In hard mode, there's a pretty serious issue with defense-heavy builds. In order to work most effectively, you need to have the Flesh Knuckles line of accessories, which are effectively exclusive to Crimson Worlds. Like we saw before, defense gets more effective the more of it you have, and getting the additional 16 or 26 defense from these accessories has an enormous impact on the damage you take when added to an already tanky build. This makes Corruption Worlds very undesirable, because the only way to obtain Flesh Knuckles in a Corruption World is to farm naturally spawning Crimson Mimics in an artificial corruption created after buying seeds from the Dryad in a graveyard, and it's a 20% drop from a rare enemy, and you need 3 of them. It's very annoying, very slow, and in almost every situation I would suggest not even trying to make an optimized tank build in Corruption Worlds. For summoners, your basic early hard mode armor is Spider Armor. For damage, you won't be beating it until post-Plantera, and your average player will use it until hollowed. For a tanky summoner though, I would do this. Ditch the Spider Head in exchange for a tier 3 melee mask, which gives about 18 extra defense in exchange for 17% damage and 1 minion slot. Use Forbidden Armor for the chest and legs. Summoner's damage, particularly with the Blade Staff, comes heavily from whip tag bonuses. Raw damage increases are not that good at this stage in the game, so losing the set bonus and the percent damage increases doesn't mean too much. Forbidden Armor gives 2 minion slots, so all we're really losing is the 1 slot from the head. And in exchange for that, we see a drastic effect on incoming damage. Retinazer's Phase 1 attacks, both contact and ranged, do almost nothing. You take a quarter as much damage as the average build, 15% as much as the damage build, and with knockback immunity, you don't have to worry at all about Retinazer's random aiming. Retinazer's Phase 2 does do a lot more damage, but the contact damage never happens. Retinazer has no melee attacks in this phase and actively stays away from you. You have to try to make him hit you. The slow-firing laser, Laser 1, does hit pretty hard, but you're still halving the damage you take per laser compared to the average build. The damage build dies in 4 hits, 5 if their potion can be used. You die in 13, 18 if your potion can be used, and that's not even factoring in HP regeneration. The fast-firing laser, Laser 2, is completely harmless to you, but pretty dangerous for the others. Spasmatism is a bit less generous. These numbers aren't bad, especially Phase 1, but the thing to keep in mind is that Spasmatism inflicts Cursed Inferno, which is indirect damage and will eat away at your HP regardless of defense. Defensive builds will allow you to take between 2 to 5 times as many hits, but Spasmatism's second phase will still hit quite hard. For Mage, unfortunately, there just are not good options for an optimized tank build at this stage in the game. Mage stats are heavily focused in the headgear, so swapping to a melee head doesn't achieve much. You might as well just use full melee at that point. I would just use the tier 3 hard mode or armor, but even with just that, we see similar results to the summoner build. This is where those flesh knuckles matter. Ranger can use the Frost Breastplate in combination with the tier 3 armor for the best results, and comes in between summoner and mage. Melee, of course, gets the highest defense and the most effective results. Now that we're post 1 mech, I'm going to assume that the optimized defense build will get an Aegis Fruit immediately, but the average player wouldn't until Plantera. We also unlock the tier 2 Old One's Army, which we're going to use heavily. If you don't want to do the Old One's Army, keep using the setup for the twins, but add an Aegis Fruit in there. For the Destroyer, we're going to try to squeeze out a few extra points of defense. We're going to swap to the Hollowed Mask as Summoner, use the Squire's Chest Armor, and continue using the Forbidden Pants. We do lose another summon slot, but our defense skyrockets, which is a huge help for the Destroyer where you gradually get whittled down by lasers. It's very important that you use a Bewitching Table, Summoning Potion, and Pygmy Necklace to recuperate lost slots. The Destroyer's Mouth will deal severe damage regardless of your defense. The contact damage of the body can be reduced massively, but isn't completely negligible, so you can't stay inside the Destroyer for safety like with the Eater. But the lasers, those can be completely ignored with a good defense build. Your standard warding build as a summoner will take about half as much damage from the Destroyer's lasers compared to a build that neglects defense. With an optimized build, you take 1 damage per laser. The lasers from the probes do deal higher damage than those from the Destroyer, and we see the exact same story. The damage build survives 4 lasers, the warding build survives 6, but the optimized defense build survives 67. Really, the optimized defense build survives indefinitely, because you'll be regenerating HP and taking potions. We had to lose another summon slot for it, but in exchange, you're nigh unkillable. As a mage, I would suggest making the hollowed mage head and using the Squire Pants and chest. Since mage stats are focused in the headpiece, we want to make sure we use that. We lose a little damage and crit, but gain mountains of defense. It's not quite as effective as the other classes, but you still take massively reduced damage. For Ranger, we'll be using the hollowed melee head, the Huntress's Jerkin, and the Squire's Greaves. The hollowed Ranger headpiece has a 23% damage buff, but 15 less defense than the melee head, whereas the Huntress chest has a 20% damage buff and only 10 less defense than the Squire chest. So, we get better value out of swapping the chest. You could also use the Frost Breastplate, which gets you another 3 defense, but you lose 9% damage for it, and this amount of defense is sufficient for this stage in the game. We end up with the same defense as the Summoner. And with melee, we slap on the Squire chest and pants with a hollowed mask. This gives quite strong damage boosts as well as incredible defense. Keeping the same armor, Skeletron Prime has a lot of different attacks, so there's a lot of information here. Let's start with the skull. When not spinning, it deals low enough contact damage that an optimized defense build can remain inside of it while taking negligible damage. When spinning, you can't do that. Even a fantastic defense build will still be taking over 100 damage per hit. Skeletron's bomb also deals very high damage, and those cannot be survived repeatedly. Because of that, you're going to want some level of mobility for this fight. You need enough to dodge the bomb and the spinning skull. Unlike the Destroyer, who you can just stand still for and occasionally dodge the mouth, Prime does require frequent movement. Aside from those two attacks, Skeletron Prime is quite non-threatening to a good defense build. Typically, most players will struggle with Prime's Laser Hand, as that is the only attack not consistently dodged by flying in a circle. It's also a very powerful laser, stronger than both Retinasers and the Destroyer's probes. Even an optimized defense build will still be taking low double-digit damage numbers from it, but that's a far cry from taking over 100, which is what the damage builds are taking. An average warding build, let's say as a ranger, since we've mostly been looking at summoner, will survive 6 laser hits, 8 if a potion is available. A non-warding build will only manage 4, 5 with a potion. That's pretty good. Assuming you're dodging as you normally would be, you trade 28% damage for surviving 50 to 60% more laser hits. We'll keep using the same armor for now, except for melee. I'm going to swap melee to turtle armor. Now, turtle armor is very bad offensively. We go from a 50% damage increase down to a 26% damage increase. We also lose 6 defense. In exchange, though, we gain a 15% damage reduction and a Thorns effect that reflects twice the incoming damage before defense reduces it. Plantera's first and second phases are drastically different. In her first phase, her contact damage is pretty much never relevant unless you are actively trying to be inside of her, so we'll consider melee for that. The turtle armor build is able to stay inside of her pretty much indefinitely when combined with iframe increases and good HP regeneration. This means you can just rush on top of Plantera in phase 1 and beat the hell out of her. For the other classes, or if melee wants to do a different strategy, we see defense again substantially reduces incoming damage from projectiles. The damage from her seeds is cut in half for a standard warding build and is completely negligible for a fully defensive build. Phase 2 is a lot trickier. Her damage skyrockets, and even the tankiest builds possible will be getting hit hard by her melee attacks. Assuming we've gotten to 500 HP by now, and looking at a mage this time, we see that a damage build will die in 3 hits from her body, 4 with a potion, a warding build will die in 4 and 5, and an optimized build can survive 6 and 7. That's not very good. Plantera's tendrils do as much damage as her main body as well. Overall, you can roughly double how long you'll survive versus a damage build if you put a lot of effort into your defense, but defense is not particularly effective against Plantera's second phase. Plantera unlocks quite a few new armors, and we'll be using a lot of them. We also gain access to the Hero Shield, which we will be using. You can add on a Paladin Shield and Frozen Shield for 6 defense each, but I haven't included those in the build numbers. For Mage, we just swap out the hollowed headpiece to the Spectre Mask, which actually has quite high defense and good damage stats. Ranger switches to the Shroomite legs and chest using the hollowed mask. The reason for this is similar to why we used the Huntress chest piece earlier. Shroomite's highest damage bonus is in the chest piece, and we gain 13 defense by not using the head, while we only lose 5 for using the chest and legs instead of squires. Melee continues to use Turtle until after Golem. Just be sure to pick up some shields from the dungeon. Summoner is going to use Hollowed Squire Tiki, which is cursed as hell, but effective. Again, it's very important to get summon slots from accessories and buffs because you'll only be getting 1 from your armor. Pumpkin Moon is available now, so you can get the 2 scrolls for 2 minions. All of these classes are hovering at almost the exact same defense here. I've said variations of the same thing enough times now, so you should get the point. A warding build lets you survive several extra hits, a highly optimized build lets you survive almost any number. Down to the last 4 bosses now, and Golem unlocks the strongest armor before the Moonlord, the Tier 3 Old One's Army armors. Every single class is going to be using the Valhalla Knight breastplate for the optimized defense build because it's just that good. It's actually a downgrade in terms of defense from Squire, but it packs a 4 HP per second HP regeneration buff, which is frankly too powerful to pass up. And this is after it got nerfed. It used to be 8 per second. For melee, we use Valhalla Knight chest and pants with a hollowed mask. This setup has incredible defense, offense, and HP regeneration because the Old One's Army armors are just stat powerhouses. While Beetle armor does offer better damage reduction thanks to the Beetle endurance buff, it gives practically no offense, whereas this set gives plenty of both. For Ranger, we'll be using the Shroomite head with Valhalla Knight pants and chest. For Mage, we use the Valhalla Knight chest, Spectre mask, and Dark Artist pants. The Dark Artist pants lose us 10 defense, but we gain 25% damage for it. Summoner uses full Valhalla Knight armor. Valhalla Knight gives slightly more raw damage than Spooky and has over twice the defense along with a very powerful HP regeneration buff. You can also take advantage of the Valhalla Knight Sep bonus, which makes your ballista fire faster upon taking damage with a strong defensive build. However, Valhalla Knight gives no minion slots. You need to have accessories and buffs giving you minion slots, and while the raw damage buffs do match Spooky, you lose 4 minions in comparison. Unfortunately, the next boss is one that defense is simply not very good against. Duke Fishron does very high damage, particularly in his second and third phases. In Phase 1, a warding build will allow you to take 1 to 2 additional hits before dying, while the optimized build lets you get 3 extra hits on top of that. The fully min-maxed build can survive 12 hits before dying, and it's actually possible to facetank Duke Fishron outright using vampire knives to sustain yourself. I'd strongly suggest an Ankh shield instead of a Paladin shield if that's your goal. You'll want every defense bonus you can get. Pull out the Life Force and Endurance potions, and I'd wire 3 Hurt statues up to a timer too. Phase 1 is easy, he can't deal much damage to you regardless. Surviving Phase 2 relies on 2 things: hitting Fishron with the knives to recover HP and avoiding standing inside the Cthulhu Nados that spawn. This strategy works because Fishron doesn't deal damage constantly. He hits hard, but you have enough time to recover with vampire knives. Being inside a Cthulhu Nado will deal too much damage too quickly. Just walk a couple blocks to the side when he summons one. For the rest of the fight, you see similar numbers. A warding build will get you an extra hit or 2 before dying, and an optimized build will get you a couple extra on top of that. On to the Empress, and you may be surprised to hear that defense is surprisingly effective against her. Yes, her melee attack and dash do a ton of damage. They're one of the few attacks to scale non-linearly, dealing unexpectedly higher damage on Master compared to Expert and Classic. But for lack of a better solution, don't get hit. Her dash, like most of her attacks, is telegraphed, and dodging it just means going down a little bit. The average warding build, like Duke Fishron, will be able to survive an extra hit or 2 compared to the damage build. When you consider that she kills you in 2 to 3 hits, taking an extra hit or 2 before dying is pretty good. For anything less than the fully min-maxed melee build, you will need to dodge a bit, but she doesn't do much damage when she hits you. You'll be taking 50 damage from most of her attacks and 80 from the harder hitting ones. It's not ideal, but as long as you do a halfway decent job of dodging her, you'll be fine. For the min-maxed build, you can mostly face tank her, although you should move to the side when she does her giant star attack. You can't sustain indefinitely, but you can out-DPS her. Vampire knives, though, let you eat all of her attacks indefinitely without issue. Cultist hits like a wet noodle of spaghetti. Warding builds, especially optimized ones, let you eat his attacks for days. Be sure to have honey or an obsidian skin potion to avoid being lit on fire. There are 3 caveats to this. His ancient light attack does deal fairly high damage, but it'll usually be destroyed before reaching you if you have good damage output. His purple ball attack, after exploding, deals immense damage, but it can be blocked with a wall. And Phantasm Dragons hurt a lot. Take a moment to make sure you're hitting the right cultist before attacking, because a dragon will rip through you. And lastly, the Moonlord, and as you'd expect, the death ray hurts. It really hurts. You can eat a death ray with an optimized defense build, but it is not comfortable. You really want to make sure you can identify when it's coming. Look for the top eye charging energy, and fly, teleport, hook, use a mount, whatever, just make sure you get out of the way. If you manage that, the rest of his attacks are very survivable. A warding build, much like with Fishron and the Empress, will give you an extra hit or 2 before dying. The optimized build can't eat attacks indefinitely, but they can survive for quite a while. The min-maxed build can survive for a very long time. In lower difficulties and multiplayer games, it's feasible to stand completely still aside from the death ray and survive. In single player on high difficulties, it's trickier. I don't think standing still and taking non-stop attacks is plausible without a nurse or large number of hurt statues sustaining you. Your odds are best if you synchronize the True Eye attack cycles and use a wall to block their death rays, like I did in Lawnmower Only. Pay attention to this here, the socket damage. This attack is very unique because it does not scale with difficulty. It deals exactly as much damage on Master as it does on Classic, but defense gets more effective on Master. That means the socket, even to a regular warding build, will only deal 1 damage a hit. More importantly, it'll give you Moonlord iframes because it's from the Moonlord. You can cheese the Moonlord with a warding build by staying in the socket. You'll want a soaring insignia or flying mount to keep up with it as it moves. This is very easy to do on Master, but on Expert requires an optimized defense build, and on Classic it's nigh impossible. So that's every attack from every boss for every class, and defense is pretty good. If you're expecting an auto win button, it'll only manage that for a few bosses and usually needs the optimized versions, but remember, you're not sacrificing mobility to do this. You can dodge normally outside of the endgame melee setup that used all the accessory slots, and even then you can still use a mount. Just by reforging your accessories to warding, taking an Iron Skin potion, and eating a medium food buff, you'll see a pretty noticeable increase to how long you can survive. All that you're sacrificing is the opportunity cost of reforging those accessories to give damage instead. Remember, in any given boss fight, all that needs to happen is you need to stay alive and the boss needs to die. By making your accessories warding, you're not making your build worse, you're just going in the make yourself harder to kill direction. The thing is, this is all theoretical. I can say X attack will deal Y damage on average, which is Z% better than the other armor, but that's both confusing and unproven. If you remember, the whole point of this was to disprove this. We saw that you aren't getting hit for 300 damage from most attacks, so let's see if the fights are going 28% faster for Menacing. I ran Killtime tests for the Eye of Cthulhu, Queen Bee, Wall of Flesh, Plantera, and Empress of Light using the builds from earlier. For the Eye of Cthulhu, as summoner, I saw the exact same kill time for the damage and defense builds, despite the defense build being down a minion slot and damage bonuses. And that makes sense. With the Menacing build, you're taking 30 to 40 damage per hit. You have to be moving constantly because you can't eat those attacks. That means the boss will be moving a lot, and your minions have to move to keep up with him. That time moving is time spent not hitting the boss. By controlling the boss's location, your minions do a much better job hitting them. Mage kills in 16 seconds with the Demon Scythe on the damage build and 23 on the warding build. That's 43% slower, a win for the Menacing build, right? Not exactly. There's a flaw with this test. I'm giving the Menacing build all of the damage buffs, and the warding build none of them. So, the Menacing build has better damage from armor and a Wrath and Rage potion. What if we just took that and gave it warding accessories? Well, we kill in 18 seconds. The bulk of the damage improvement was coming from armor and potions, not the reforges. In fact, by just reforging to warding, we see a drastic improvement in our survivability with hardly any kill time lost. This is a better build than either of the two that focused solely on damage and defense. When the armor is different, I'm going to keep testing this to see how much is coming from Menacing accessories and how much is coming from the other buffs. Melee and Ranger see similar results. The Blade of Grass and Boomstick took 22 and 20 seconds, which goes down to 40 and 37 when using Platinum armor, almost twice the time. But if we keep using the Gi and Ancient Shadow armor, we kill it in 27 and 25 seconds. On Queen Bee, we have another problem. She's a very high variance boss. She doesn't always do the same attacks, and with good or bad RNG, the fight can take very different amounts of time. I actually died twice to Queen Bee when doing these as summoner, once with the damage build and once with the defense build. Part of the issue with kill time testing is that it's not realistic. Your average player isn't trying to have permanent DPS uptime and isn't throwing themselves in front of attacks to make sure they're dealing damage constantly. I am here. With that said, the Menacing build on Summoner worked out to be quite a bit faster than the Warding one with good RNG. However, the Menacing build falls apart quickly if you mess up, whereas the Warding build never felt like I was close to dying, even with bad RNG. The one time I died as the Menacing build was just because I made a couple bad dodges. For Ranger and Mage, we barely see a difference in the kill times. Much like Summoner against the Eye, having a Warding build lets us move around less, which means the boss moves around less, which makes our projectiles more accurate. When we put on the high damage armor and warding accessories, our kill times are faster than with Menacing. Melee had its fastest kill time on the Menacing build, but also its slowest. Because of Queen Bee's high variance, she might spend a ton of time dashing around and barely be hittable, or she might just stand still and let you whack her. The Warding build was more consistent with its damage, letting us stay closer to deal it. The Warding build with the damage buffs gave us an extremely consistent result that was faster than both of the others. Mage died once against the wall, and it's because those lasers deal 87 damage. The Menacing kill time was barely faster than the Warding one, it was slower than the Warding and damage armor one. There is just no good reason to use it over Warding as Mage in pre-hard mode. Yes, your damage is a little bit higher, but you also can't position yourself to deal it as effectively because your first priority has to be evasion because these lasers will shred through you. Ranger saw Menacing perform better than Warding, and it wasn't negligible. I am a lot more experienced with Ranger, and without having the delayed shots that the Demon Scythe has, it's a lot easier to dodge and aim at the same time, so positioning matters less. Even with the Star Cannon, I'm comfortable enough using it that I can stay point blank and fire upwards. I actually only died trying it on the Warding build. That's because if you're staying this close, you need to do it without messing up because the Hungry will rip you to pieces regardless of your defense once the wall drops below half HP. Melee saw a small difference. The Knight's Edge is so overpowered that if you cram all the eyes into a space like this, it doesn't matter what your accessories are. Summoner, on the other hand, I died a lot, repeatedly, constantly. Even when I managed to kill the wall, I would die doing it. When I finally managed to scrape together a non-Pyrrhic victory, I was one hit from death. The respawning Hungry made it very difficult to actually have my minions target the wall, so I'd often just lose the DPS race and get killed by lasers. The Warding build never even came close to dying. I took so little damage from the lasers in comparison. In pre-hard mode, warding is pretty much always better. Does that hold for hard mode though? Now we're going to add Flesh Knuckles and Berserker's Gloves to the defense build, so it's not going to be just warding. The damage build will have emblems and other damage boosts instead, or better mobility. And, well, since our first test is melee and it's Plantera, yeah, warding wins. The true Excalibur is really good. If you can stay near Plantera with high attack bonuses, you'll rip her to pieces in about 30 seconds. But it's dangerous to stay that close to her. It's hard to avoid her projectiles and stay close enough to hit her, and in phase 2, a couple wrong steps and you're dead. But a full tank build with total armor can face tank and out DPS her with the fetid Bagnax every single time, consistently, and it's faster. I'm not even using Life Force, Endurance, Wrath, or Rage potions, and I can still win the race comfortably. Using the high damage armor with warding reforges, I never felt like I was close to dying, but still killed her at about the same speed as the Menacing build. Mage, similarly, died a lot with the Menacing build. Plantera hits really hard, and the Venom Staff just doesn't really cut through her fast enough to burst her down like the true Excalibur does. It took me about twice as long to kill her, and you're much squishier. The warding build was a bit slower, but I didn't die doing it. The high damage armor and warding build was as fast as my fastest time, and I also didn't die at all trying it. For Ranger, we see the exact same pattern again. Full damage Menacing is faster, warding is a bit slower but safer, and the high damage armor with warding is only slightly slower while also granting pretty noticeable improvements in survivability. As Summoner, oh boy, I died even more than as Mage. The phase 1 damage is great, but the minions just stop focusing Plantera in phase 2 and attack her tendrils instead. You also have to stay close to whip her or else your damage falls apart. I had to actually intentionally kill the tendrils before killing her, which I never do, and that caused Summoner to be the slowest class to kill her. Conversely, with the defensive build, I never died and my kill times were only slightly slower despite having 2 fewer minion slots. I could actually afford to stay close enough to whip her consistently throughout the fight. For the Empress, I'm not going to only give the damage potions to the damage build and the defense potions to the defense build. Honestly, I've been giving the damage build a serious edge because a regeneration and iron skin potion are nowhere near as strong as a wrath and rage potion. Both builds will be using their best items, with everything in it optimized to be as efficient as possible. These are about the most effective builds you can have at this stage of the game, one geared for defense and the other for offense. Summoner knocks it out of the park with a kill time that is barely behind the damage build despite having no minion slots from armor. By using full Valhalla Knight, we can utilize Ballista to their maximum strength, and we have the defense to keep the Empress mostly still. By backing them up with minion slots from accessories and buffs, we can still shred her to pieces without coming very close to dying. It might look like I'm coming close, but HP is a resource. I'm expending it to allow me to attack her. I know she doesn't have the damage to kill me. Mage isn't quite as impressive. The damage build keeps pace with Summoner. Betsy's Wrath and the Razorpine are an incredibly powerful combo. We fall behind with warding, but also survive a lot more hits. If you mess up with the damage build, it's a bit catastrophic. With the warding build, it's an inconvenience that can build up over time. Warding reforges alone aren't going to do a lot at this stage in the game. It'll get you an extra hit or two, but not this many. The extra defense from the accessories and armor is what's carrying the defensive build to be particularly effective at keeping me alive. I ran Killtime tests for the Tsunami and Snowman Cannon as Ranger. The Tsunami is faster, not far behind the Razorpine and Betsy's Wrath combo, but requires pretty good aim and predicting where the Empress will move to. The Snowman Cannon is slower, but has homing. I'd recommend using it over a gun with chlorophyte bullets. We actually don't see an improvement by keeping the Empress in one location with the defense build. She's harder to hit there, because you either have a homing attack that doesn't care where she is, or an attack that requires you to predict her movement, which is easiest when you're leading her in one direction instead of having her wiggle back and forth. It's slower, but like with Mage, allows you to make multiple consecutive mistakes and walk away without a problem. Melee has the slowest times on the Empress, largely due to her constant movement away from you, which makes it difficult to actually hit her. I found the Terrorblade to be the most consistent, closely followed by the Flareon and trailed by the Flying Dragon. While the Flying Dragon has great damage, it's really difficult to hit the Empress with it compared to the Terrorblade's giant projectiles and the Flareon's homing. The defense build can deal damage a lot more aggressively, and you can even get close enough to hit her with the melee swing and the projectile consistently. It's still slower though, except for the Flying Dragon. We can make sure our projectiles hit by staying close and can hit her with the actual swing. It's faster than the damage build Flying Dragon and barely behind the damage build Terrorblade and Flareon. You can't stay on her constantly, but can put in some serious damage very quickly by getting point blank. The melee setup can even get enough defense to outright face tank her and win. I'm not using all of my accessories devoted to defense, and I don't have an endurance or life force potion, so I could be even more effective, but I can take almost all of her attacks just dodging the big star in her dashes and win. With the vampire knives, I can outright stand completely still without ever coming close to dying. So yeah, defense is really, really good. I'd go so far as to say that warding builds are almost always better than menacing builds. If you want damage, get it from accessories, armor, and potions, not your reforges. Part of the reason for that is that damage bonuses get less effective the more of them you have, while defensive bonuses get more effective the more of them you have. Let's say you deal 50 damage with an attack. Between emblems, armor, and potions, you've got a 72% damage buff. That means you now deal 86 damage per hit. That is the baseline for comparing what Menacing will do. If we add Menacing now, we don't multiply 86 by 1.28 because the 28% damage applies to the original damage, it's not multiplicative. We go up to 100 damage a hit, which is only a 16% increase in our damage, not a 28% increase. Conversely, let's say we're taking a 100 damage hit and we have 72 defense. We're now taking 28 damage instead of 100 damage, which is 72% less damage. That is our baseline for comparing what warding will affect. If we add warding now, we take 28 less damage per hit from 28, which is a 96% reduction in damage. Even if we up that damage number to 150, which means we take 78 damage per hit and warding reduces that to 50, that's a 36% reduction in the damage taken. Each individual point of defense you add on is more effective relative to the ones before it, while each damage increase gets less effective. This is why min-maxing your defense and getting the extra points from Flesh Knuckles and Hero Shields can be so impactful. If you put a ton of effort into defense, you'll feel unkillable against most bosses. I will give a word of warning. Playing the game like this, with the optimized builds, can be quite boring. There's a reason I enjoyed Flare Gun only more than Copper Short Sword and Lawnmower only, and that's because the Flare Gun didn't require me to min-max a tank build, whereas the latter two did. Without many things that can meaningfully threaten you, the game isn't too interesting. That's also why I made setups for each class that tried to balance defense and damage, because while you're still tanky, you're not AFK and be perfectly fine tanky. I usually only do builds like that in challenges where taking constant damage for extended periods of time is pretty much mandatory, like Lawnmower only, or in multiplayer games where you focus on controlling aggro and get to have fun with that. So far, I've only covered armor and accessories that directly increase defense. Let's talk about all the other ways to survive longer and make defense builds better. Firstly, potions. Iron Skin, regeneration, and food buffs are your bread and butter. You should always have them during boss fights, they're trivial to make. If you run out of mushrooms, bring purification powder to the corruption and throw it at the evil mushrooms to turn them to regular ones. A regeneration potion provides 2 HP per second, which is like eating a free honey fin every minute, while an Iron Skin potion is basically a drinkable Flesh Knuckles. For food, your easiest source is pumpkin seeds from the Dryad. Buy and plant them across the surface, they'll be ready to harvest in about a day and give a medium food buff when cooked. Fishing is also a decent source, you'll need a cooking pot for most of those. You'll get 3 defense for a medium buff, 2 for a minor one, and 4 for a major one. Major buffs are hard to come by, your best source is the Powder Girl selling pig vignettes, which can drop bacon. Food also says it increases HP regeneration, which is true but not straightforward. Expert mode nerfs your base regeneration. Eating food restores it to its normal value. Endurance, warmth, and life force potions are the expensive deli meats of your defense sandwich. Nice to have, but too costly to use regularly. They all require fishing for ingredients and more difficult herbs. Endurance potions are good when you're taking a lot of damage in one hit. Against the late game bosses that still deal 50, 80, 100 damage to defensive builds, they're good. For characters that aren't putting much effort into defense, they're good. When you're taking 5, 10, 20 damage per hit, they do almost nothing. Life Force potions, just tack on an extra 80 to 100 HP to your life total. It usually works out to be an extra hit or two before dying, substantially more if you've got an optimized defense build. If there's a fight you're not confident about, bring some. Warmth potions are quite potent, giving a 30% damage reduction to cold attacks, but since it's against cold attacks, that means it's only really useful against Deerclops and Frostmoon. It is a good idea to pick them up for those. You can fish up frost minnows in the snow biome. You should also bring obsidian skin potions to the Cultist, Golem, and Wall of Flesh and For the Worthy and get Fixed Boy seeds. They can all inflict on fire, and obsidian skin provides immunity to that. Placed buffs are very straightforward. Hout lanterns, campfires, bass statues. Hout lanterns are made with a life crystal and chain and give 1 HP per second, while campfires give half a hit point and a small increase to your natural regeneration. Together, they're like drinking a free healing potion every minute. Chains can be made with an iron or lead bar at an anvil. Both are easy to craft and you should put them in every arena you make. Bass statues provide a meager 5 defense, which isn't a huge impact by itself, but defense builds are a collection of defense from miscellaneous sources that all combine together. You can pick them up in chests in the bottom 3/7 of the underground desert, or more likely as furniture in cabins in the underground desert at any depth. In the more niche category, honey gives you a 1 HP per second regeneration buff when standing in it and for 30 seconds after leaving it. It also reduces damage over time debuffs by 2 damage per second. That makes it particularly good against Queen Bee and the poison debuff, and otherwise a buff that functions like an additional Hout lantern. The difficulty is that honey needs to be physically entered, which slows you down immensely. If you're going for a strategy that doesn't move much, be sure to put it down. Bubble blocks from the Powder Girl in Hout mode help a lot. If you're dodging, you can either skip it or try to put a patch that you can enter in briefly for the buff. It can also be used to nullify on fire and will cancel the werewolf form of a nighttime celestial shell. If you've got a shell, be sure to wiggle in and out of the honey to keep the HP regeneration and defense buffs of the werewolf form. All these HP regeneration buffs, like defense, are individually not that strong, but provide a fearsomely potent effect when combined. A regeneration potion, Hout Lantern, Campfire, Honey, Celestial Shell at Night, and Valhalla Knight's Breastplate provide 10 HP per second collectively. Defense is good alone, but backing it up with the ability to recover lost HP quickly is the key to maximum effectiveness. The most powerful HP recovery tool is one I've made scarce few mentions of, simply due to how strong it is. You don't need it to be effective, and it would be disingenuous to use it and act like the defense is doing the heavy lifting, but if you use it, your ability to sustain yourself will skyrocket. I'm talking about Hout statues. Every 10 seconds, they will cough up a Hout, healing for 20 HP. For the sake of this video, we're going to be putting 3 statues on top of each other and making 3 Houts every 10 seconds because that's the local limit before they stop working, but I described ways to increase their efficiency in my Hoik guide. If you stand on top of 3 Hout statues, they will average out to healing you for 6 HP per second, and you don't have to stand on top of them. The Houts aren't going anywhere, and Hout Reach potions let you collect from a distance. 3 Hout statues by themselves are as powerful as a regeneration potion, Hout Lantern, Campfire, Honey, and Nighttime Celestial Shell combined. Only Vampire Knives and Spectre Armor recover HP at a faster rate than Hout statues. You'll find them underground, usually in cabins and mushroom biomes. They're highlighted by Spelunker potions and need to be hooked up to a timer with wire. They also have a global limit. If there are 10 Houts anywhere in the world, they will not produce Houts. So, if you've been playing for a while, you may need to save and quit to despawn random dropped Houts to make the statues work. On the flip side, they actually bug out and remove their local and global limits if too many items are dropped in the world. I'm not sure on the exact number, I believe it's around 200, but once a certain number of items are dropped on the ground, Hout statues will just spit out Houts every 10 seconds, eventually despawning older items due to the dropped items limit. They are extremely powerful, easily the highest value statue in the game. There's also the Nurse, who borders on game-breaking. If you have the money, she is a full heal and debuff cleanse with no cooldown. Keeping her nearby with a recall potion and a bed with good reflexes lets you heal the full without missing a beat. You do have to make sure she doesn't die though. As far as accessories, in pre-Hout mode, there aren't really any. Getting a Warding Reforge is more important than anything else, so flippers and shackles are actually quite good due to their low price. Mage can use Celestial Cuffs to translate incoming damage to mana. Much like how Thorn's effects work, Celestial Cuffs give you mana equal to the damage you would have taken before defense, so high defense builds can get a lot of value out of them. I usually just use the Obsidian Shield and Band of Regeneration, which functions like an equipable Hout Lantern, with the rest of my accessories devoted to mobility or utility. Come Hout mode, the Cross Necklace doubles the number of iframes you receive when hit, and increases the iframes from dodging an attack by 50%. I only like it when outright face tanking. If you're taking damage constantly, it pretty much doubles your HP. If you're dodging, it's kind of like an off-brand Obsidian Shield in the sense that it prevents you from getting hit multiple times in rapid succession, but I'd rather have the shield. The Band of Regen upgrades to a Charm of Myths, which upgrades its healing potential. Using greater healing potions every 45 seconds, you upgrade from 60 per minute to 97.5 per minute on average. It can't be swapped out for a reduced cooldown anymore, unfortunately. It's a decent choice that will help, but I wouldn't bend over backwards to farm mimics for it. Flesh Knuckles are the core of Hout mode defense builds. They give 8 defense, with the upgrades giving an additional 8 and 10. Combined, they give 26, which is like having all of your accessories reforged to warding again. I'd suggest using Shimmer to reforge the glove and hero shield because they're very expensive. The Obsidian Shield can be upgraded to the Ankh Shield, which is fine. It's good for the dungeon, Duke Fishron, and Frostmoon, otherwise it's basically just an Obsidian Shield with +2 defense. The Frostmoon bit might seem weird, but the Ankh Shield gives chilled immunity despite none of its ingredients giving it, meaning that absurdly long debuff that Ice Queen inflicts is nullified. In the dungeon, it's good because cursed, and against Fishron, it's good because he inflicts Feral Bite on Expert and above, which randomly inflicts debuffs, every single one of which is prevented by the Ankh Shield. Feral Bite also has a hidden 20% damage buff, which can be taken advantage of with a bat statue and Ankh Shield. It's clunky, and I wouldn't say it's good, but it can be pretty fun. The Frozen Total Shell is overrated, but the Frozen Shield is quite good, since it's just a Paladin Shield with upside. I only seek out Paladin Shields if I'm trying to optimize a defense build, but those 6 points of defense can go a long way. The Flesh Knuckles, Berserker's Glove, Hero Shield, Frozen Shield, Paladin Shield, Celestial Shell, and Star Veil are about the most effective build you can make. The Celestial Shell is basically an Avenger emblem, Flesh Knuckles, and Charm of Myths all rolled into one accessory slot with even more miscellaneous buffs. It is phenomenal. Every build will benefit from one. But what if you're good at dodging and aren't taking damage to begin with? That's a more interesting question. In a lot of games, the high skill strategy is to ignore defense because you won't be getting hit and just prioritize damage. You've got things like Red Tearstone Rings and Fury of the Fallen, where players intentionally put themselves one hit from death for a damage buff. So, is Terraria a game where that behavior makes sense? In my opinion, no. Terraria is not a very consistent game. Enemies can spawn during boss fights, Queen Bee, Deerclops, Retinazer, and Queen Slime all have elements of randomness to their aiming as well. I don't expect to get hit. I don't expect to die, but I keep an obsidian shield on regardless because I know I will mess up eventually. I will get hit. The game is not consistent enough for me to confidently assert the opposite, and if I can't confidently assert that, I don't want to throw all my eggs in a basket made of glass. If it isn't obvious, I play a lot of hardcore. This is a very hardcore-centered mindset. I've done plenty of things with low defense and haven't struggled much with them, but I don't think the just don't get hit mindset fits very well in Terraria because there's a lot of inconsistency in the game. Defense is a counterbalancing force against that inconsistency and randomness. This is not me saying that damage builds suck or bosses can't be dodged consistently. Not at all. What I am saying is that just because you can dodge doesn't mean defense is useless. Defense is not the only counterforce against randomness, though. Because Terraria is a sandbox, there are plenty of ways to over-engineer arenas or take advantage of AI deficits to make it impossible for bosses to deal damage to you at all. In situations like this, defense does nothing, yeah. If you're cheesing bosses or are building arenas where you can't really be damaged, then defense isn't going to help much. Everything in this video up to now has been talking about Master Mode. Defense will only be more effective on Expert and Classic, but what about Legendary? On the For the Worthy and Get Fixed Boy seeds, enemies deal heavily increased contact damage. If Classic is 1x damage, Expert is 2x, and Master is 3x, then Legendary is 4x, and it's multiplied by 1.33 after that, and defense is only as effective as on Master Mode. So, against contact damage, defense is not going to be nearly as effective as in the normal difficulties. The primary thing it does is turn one-shot attacks into two-shot attacks, two-shot attacks into three-shot attacks, and reduce projectile damage considerably. While contact damage, the damage you receive when an enemy physically touches you, is drastically increased, projectile damage is not increased. Projectiles do exactly as much damage as in Master Mode, and defense is just as effective as it is there. You just have to be sure to avoid physically contacting enemies. The Empress of Light is almost entirely projectiles, defense works about as well as on Master Mode. Duke Fishron is mostly contact damage, defense might let you turn a one-shot into a two-shot. The Destroyer is almost entirely projectiles, as is the Moonlord. Plantera is mostly contact damage, but it's actually extremely good against her regardless. Plantera spawns thorns whenever she moves her hooks, which deal 100 base damage. Against characters with more than 100 defense, that's nothing, they can be pretty much ignored. It's also a massive help with another extremely annoying For the Worthy change. The Wall of Flesh spawns imps, repeatedly, which shoot projectiles at a massively increased speed that cannot be destroyed. The most effective strategy for mitigating them is to put imp banners all over the underworld, which can be found with an imp statue. That's got nothing to do with defense, but banners reduce incoming damage by 50%, but unlike normal damage reduction, it applies before defense, not after. An imp sphere counts as contact damage, so it has its damage increased considerably, up to 160. A ranger without warding buffs will likely have around 32 defense, with warding buffs 56. Without a banner, the player would take about 128 damage without warding and 104 with it. That's pretty bad, but with banners, the player takes 48 damage without warding and 24 with it. That is massive. You're taking half as much damage from the burning spheres, which are extremely difficult to avoid and are primarily what will be hitting you alongside the lasers, which it has similar effectiveness against. Be sure to take an obsidian skin potion along as well. So, while it doesn't have the same role as in Master Mode, defense is far from useless. It's not going to win the game for you, but it will help out a lot. Projectiles are the most likely attacks to be hitting you, and defense is most effective against projectiles. There are three types of players that want a ton of defense. The first is the one who just wants to not get melted quickly. They're looking for a buffer before they die. They'll put on warding, maybe a couple defensive accessories, but not optimize excessively. They'll still have damage bonuses and some appropriate armor. They're the player that most of this video has been about. The second is the multiplayer tank, whose purpose is to take damage constantly and control boss movements. They want raw defense and as much of it as possible. Mobility doesn't matter, they're here to stop bosses from attacking other players and keep them in an easy-to-hit area. The third is the hardcore player, whose goal is just to not die. Damage doesn't matter as long as you meet the minimum DPS. Mobility is very important because it lets you avoid attacks. Defense and damage reduction are vital because they let you mitigate damage when you inevitably mess up. This is the player that wants beetle armor. All that you care about is staying alive. You dodge, and when you do get hit, you've got a Mountain of Defense, the 45% damage reduction from Beetle Endurance, an Endurance Potion, a Worm Scarf. The attack will deal minimal damage. You go back to dodging, your Beetle Endurance recharges, your HP regenerates, and you keep doing that until the boss dies. Your damage will suck, because Beetle Armor sucks offensively, but what it does best is keep you alive when you're consistently dodging most attacks. It's not very good for multiplayer tanks because repeated hits and Paladin Shield damage will eat through the buff, but it's the best armor in the game for consistent late-game hardcore. Being a hardcore tank is very straightforward. You slap on melee armor that provides the best defense, you reforge everything to warding, you use as many mobility accessories as you need, and you put everything else towards keeping you alive. If high defense lets an inexperienced player get hit frequently and stay alive, it lets an experienced player that gets hit infrequently live forever. So I've covered the hardcore tank, and we talked about the casual tank. Let's go over the multiplayer tank. If you've watched me play multiplayer, this is the role I usually take. The multiplayer tank has 3 goals: keep your teammates alive, keep the boss in a place they can attack, and keep yourself alive. Keeping your teammates alive lets them keep attacking the boss and lets them focus their builds on damage. In pre-hard mode, this can mean keeping the boss off to the side while they shoot from a distance. In hard mode, increased aggro accessories let you keep their focus on you. You don't want to move around erratically and get your teammates caught in the crossfire. Keeping the boss in a place they can attack usually means moving as little as possible. On bosses like the Skeletrons, Empress of Light, Lunatic Cultist, and Moonlord, having them moving around chasing people makes it very difficult for multiple players to land attacks. This lowers your damage significantly and exposes all the squishy players to danger. Having somebody who can face tank attacks that isn't moving much keeps them in a constant location where your allies can shoot them easily. You may need to dodge some attacks like spinning Skeletrons and Death Rays, but try to keep the boss moving as little as possible. To do this, you'll want to maintain the boss's aggro. You'll want to stay close to them so they keep targeting you and keep other players away so it doesn't target them. Items that increase aggro, like Flesh Knuckles and Turtle Armor, work by making the game think that the player is closer to enemies than they actually are, and conversely, reducing aggro makes the game think that you're further away than you actually are. Enemies generally attack the perceived closest player to them. Even in single player, aggro reduction will cause enemies to ignore you if you're far enough away from them. It's particularly handy when fishing. Duke Fishron, uniquely, ignores aggro entirely after choosing a target. He latches on to one player and does not stop attacking them until they die. That means it's very important for the multiplayer tank to be the one closest to Duke Fishron when he spawns so he begins attacking them. Other players should try to keep their distance while they dodge. Lastly, your final goal, and usually the most important one, stay alive. You're the knot that's tying the team together, and when you die, the boss will start chasing down and killing your teammates, and they die a lot faster than you do. On top of that, you staying alive gives your dead teammates time to respawn and rejoin the fight. As long as one player stays alive, the boss won't leave, outside of the time-limited ones. You are that player, and you're supporting everyone even if your damage is low. If you don't like warding, after all this, ask yourself this: what number would make it worth it? I've shown, both through calculation and testing, that Menacing and Lucky Reforges are usually doing a lot less than 28% for your overall time to kill. Is it worth it if your warding Reforges let you survive 28% longer? 50% longer? Twice as long? Because it can do all of that. It's least effective against attacks that deal hundreds of damage, and warding will often allow you to get an entire extra hit before dying on those. If you go from dying in 2 hits to dying in 3, that's a 50% increase. Going from 3 to 4 is a 33% increase. That's what putting warding on a damage build for Fishron, the Empress, and the Moonlord will typically achieve, and I think that's better than killing 10-15% faster. And this is the worst case scenario. Warding is better on Classic and Expert and against every boss before the final 3, and the more effort you put into defense, the better it will be. It's fine to look at the Moonlord and Fishron and go, I'd rather have a damage buff. I don't like my odds of surviving longer off of warding, but using the Moonlord as an argument for why warding is bad is pretty flawed when the entire rest of the game exists. It's not that damage is bad, it's just that Menacing is. Here's another way to look at it. Emblems give you 15%, 12%, and 18% damage. The highest value damage accessory is 20% effective damage increase, and you can get 2 of them. 10% damage buffs are a dime a dozen. The highest value defense accessory gives 10 defense, followed by 8, 8, 7, and 6. It takes 5 Menacing or Lucky Reforges to match the best offensive accessory. It takes 2.5 Warding Reforges to match the best defense one. You get much better value out of spending your slots on damage and Reforges on defense than spending slots on defense and Reforges on damage. You could spend both on damage, but the returns diminish the more damage you have because they apply off the base number. A food buff gives you 40% as much defense as it gives you damage. You can get magic power potions, archery potions, ale, rage, wrath, but you can only get 1 iron skin and 1 food buff, and they only give you 12 defense at most. Reforges treat percent damage increases and defense as equal. The rest of the game treats defense as much more valuable. You should too, because it is.